We are back. Welcome to the Leadership Launchpad Project. I'm Rob Kalvarowski, and as always, the yin to my yang, Susan Hobson. Susan, how are you?
I am great. I'm so fired up. We have one of our all-time favorite guests back on the show today. Ooh! So let's go. Let's get this party started.
Let's get this party started. And as my dog goes to protect,
Protect the property.
that's right. We got to start off with a quote, and this is one we were talking about the other day, and it's from Khalil Gibran, and he says, "Out of suffering have emerged the strongest souls. The most massive characters are seared with scars."
Tell us why you shared that with our peeps today.
And it's something we were talking about, right? Is life has a way of throwing you what you need when you need it. And that is oftentimes in challenges, in pain, and in suffering. And if we can find the wisdom in that pain, that's when we can emerge anew.
I mean, that's what this whole show was born out of, right? This core belief that we have definitely discovered on our purpose-driven journeys, which is adversity is just the opportunity for growth, just dressed up in disguise as adversity, right? Because that adversity builds capacity. That adversity is what helps us discover that untapped potential. Oof. It's just hard to remember that when you're going through it.
And as you mentioned, one of our favorite guests, the man who preaches meaning, Zach Mercurio, is back with us. Zach, how are you?
I'm great. I'm doing well. It's summer in Colorado, and I love that quote as well. So thanks for
How
sharing
did it
that.
resonate with you, Zach?
That's what I was going to ask.
Well, life itself needs stress to survive. Life needs resistance. If it wasn't for resistance, life would not carry on. So constraints create life. You know, it's like goes back to what's the Jurassic Park? Jeff Goldblum says life will find a way. Right. And it's true. It's cliche, but it's true. We need resistance to live. Every organism needs resistance to thrive.
I absolutely love it. Zach, catch our audience up to speed. We haven't spoken to you in over a year now. So what have you been up to since we last had you on the show?
Yeah, a really interesting study we wrapped up over the last year and a half. We studied 1,300 employees, and we wanted to know what leadership practices predicted the experience of meaningfulness, intrinsic motivation, the reduced intention to leave an organization or an occupation, job satisfaction, and the experience of mattering. And that was a very eye-opening study that came out of another study with 12 leaders at these very large organizations. And we found some really remarkable, interesting things. And one of those things is that most leadership is interpersonal. So how we relate to another human being, that transaction, that transformational space between the leader and who you're leading, that is the space in which leadership occurs, not in these grand ideas, these grand theories, these grand agile philosophies, but in the interpersonal interaction.
And is that only one-on-one, or how does that show up in the space of teams?
Well, 1-to-1, 1-to-10, 1-to-20, but it's the interaction. And it actually, most of the practices that we found predict, like meaningfulness, intrinsic motivation, low turnover intention, are things that cost no money.
Wow.
They are things like integrity, modeling the organization's values consistently so your people can see them. Things like impact, making sure you tell people regularly and show people clearly what the upstream impact of their work is. Connections, caring about people's personal lives, making a personal connection, fostering peer relationships. Things like autonomy, giving people freedom over how they do their work. And then nurturing potential, believing in people, talking to people about their goals, investing in their aspirations, giving people the tools to grow. All of those things, it's the basics of caring for other humans.
And it's funny because we had Russ Laraway on the show.
That's right.
A few weeks ago, and he did a similar study at Qualtrics where he was trying to model the leadership behaviors that would predict engagement, basically. And it was very similar. The results were like, having these career conversations, understanding the people's values, aligning them and setting them up for growth over their career, and all these things. I'm happy that they're all aligning.
And I'm curious if these are things that we would expect leaders to bring to the table, or if these are actual skill sets that could be developed in leaders.
I would argue that.
Skills,
I would argue
right?
that. I would argue they're skills.
Yeah.
When you get into this idea that leadership is intuitive, you get into a very self-limiting problem, because intuition is not scalable. Like if you have an organization, you cannot scale someone's intuition to lead. Like for example, we don't trust pilots to rely on intuition,
Right.
to fly a plane.
Right.
We shouldn't rely on leaders to trust intuition to be responsible for the place where human beings spend 35% of their waking lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's something that we've been looking at. We interviewed an expert on the show here, Bonnie Low-Cramen, I believe her last name was, and she was riffing on how it's usually takes till a leader's about 46 years old to actually run into this type of opportunity within the context of their organization to even get trained on some of these leadership interpersonal skill sets. Curious what your thoughts on that are, since you've been doing all this research in and around how requisite these skills are as it pertains to a leader's capacity to serve the growth of their people in their organizations.
So I challenged that notion a little bit.
I hoped you would.
The way I challenge it is that Amy Edmondson, pretty much the godmother of psychological safety, wrote the Fearless Organization. She posted something recently that said, leadership is a role, leading is a behavior. So it may take someone until they're 46 to get into a role of leadership, but leading starts as soon as you can open your mouth and learn language. So we should be teaching these skills in K through 12 education on how to interpersonally connect with each other, how to have a vision, how to disagree with people, how to get feedback, how to give feedback, how to create safe spaces emotionally for each other, how to show people the difference that they make, how to create an experience where you notice and see somebody for who they are, how to check in with your delivery driver personally and know their last name. I mean, these are like the things that we're doing studies now about what leaders need to know, but it's really kindergarten morality. And so what we need to do, in my opinion, is that we need to bring this idea of leadership and not stop making it so big, stop making it something that you attain once you get there, but start making it leading as the behavior, something that we can learn wherever we are in life. And then when you get to a position of leadership, the behaviors that you've developed, just like riding a bike, will be natural to you. And we won't be doing podcasts about this as much.
Right? We will be obsolete. Is that what you're telling us?
I don't think that's going to happen because we have to re-socialize everybody. But I'm saying that we have to look bigger.
Yeah.
And we have to think differently about leadership as less of like a role that people have and more of a behavior that people do, because then it becomes something that we can develop. It's like, and we don't get this if then, well, I'm not in a leadership role. And you see that actually there's another effect of this. One of the questions that Rob, sent me, and I'm sorry to preview it. I'll preview it.
Just go for it.
What should people do?
We're not going there anyway. So
what should people do if they have a toxic boss?
Yeah.
Right. So what typically happens is that we say, oh, well, my leader doesn't do this for me.
Yeah.
Doesn't create mattering or meaningfulness for me. And then I always say, well, do you do it for them?
Love that.
What kind of leader are you to them? How are you complicit in creating the conditions for the behaviors you say you don't want? Do you do what you expect your leader to do for you? Do you do that for them? And oftentimes people are like, stop, right? Because they think leadership is positional. Someone above is going to create something for me versus I'm a co-creator in the thing I'm in.
That's what it's all about right there, that word co-creation.
But if you think of leadership as a role you won't get to when you're 50, then it's very easy to seep into let me wait for culture to be created for me versus let me participate in creating the culture I say I want.
Yes.
That's leading.
It's sharing in the responsibility, right? Sorry, Rob.
And what's the barrier for that? Because this is something that there's both like this aspect of like learned helplessness, and even our education system, which we did talk about before on the show, but it's like you're sitting in a class, the teacher's standing up there telling you basically the answers, how to think and all this stuff, right? And then it's like we arrive in the workplace and we're not taking responsibility for ourselves or our roles. So like, what do you see as the gap?
I think it's a lot human psychology, attribution error. We tend to attribute, for things that are going wrong in our lives, we tend to attribute to other people or other things outside of our control. It's what companies do too, because companies are just human beings who organize, right? So like, they'll just go up the street for an extra $1 on the hour. That's why we're losing people, right? We attribute everything that's going wrong to something else, but we attribute usually things that are going well to ourselves. And so it's just natural human psychology. So I think we have to overcome that barrier and really stop and be able to reframe a situation. What else could be happening here? The other thing, and I don't know, you all are going to have to help me out with this because I can't figure it out. I've been doing a lot of work in the healthcare system on, resilience. And a lot of people say to me, well, Zach, we wouldn't need to be resilient if the systems weren't making us need to be resilient. And that's true. That's true, right? The systems are creating a lot of the need to be resilient that we see. And those things can be changed and should be changed, the environmental presses. But, and this is the big but, is that, but what we know when the research about resilience, for example, is that the number one thing that predicts resilience is the individual's response, not the risk factor. So, Viktor Frankl, author of Man's Search for Meaning, says between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our growth and our freedom. I think what happens is people get scared of that space, that they are responsible over that space of responding. But I also think it's that people don't know how.
Which would explain the fear.
Yeah. And so when we don't know how to do something, we usually get defensive. Like when someone asks us to do something, but we don't know how, it usually results in defensiveness, or I'm not going to do that. Or a lot of leaders say that's the fluffy stuff, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're saying it's the fluffy stuff, you probably need it the most.
Yes, totally.
But so I think it's hard and people don't have the skill to do it. We rely on intuition. So I think going back to the first comment is that leading is a behavior, it's a skill set, and it has to be learned, taught, and cultivated.
For me, it takes perspective. And I was thinking yesterday, and Susan knows this quote sort of came out, and it basically said that life is a series of ego traps that prevent us from seeing the perfection of this moment. And this is one of those traps. Is often things are neither good nor bad, they just are, and then we put judgment upon them. And that's where we start to get into these traps of either I'm not good enough or the world's bad or, all these other things. And that's the resiliency piece is both internalizing it, right? And a lot of the high achievers that Susan and I work with, they're very much, they blame themselves. It's my fault.
Right.
That I didn't succeed, even though all these things were out of my control, it's still my fault.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
There's that. And then there's the opposite people who are like, nothing's my fault because I'm perfect.
Yeah, totally.
Right. And I mean, often, people are in the spectrum in the middle, but these are the types of things that none of those are true. It's often both. There is outside and there is inside, and we must live in that gray.
Exactly.
My question is, yeah, how do we help? Where do we start if we're trying to help people close that gap, right? In terms of helping them, because if they're afraid of what they don't know, like how do we actually step into that space and create bridges so that we can actually empower them to take the ownership, to even want to develop the skill set?
Tell me where that question is coming from. Do you experience a lot of people who don't want to?
I think it's hard. I think especially for high achievers, it's a really hard space to not know. It's an extremely defensive space like we're looking at, right? So I think we got a bunch of experts in the room who obviously see that resistance playing out in real time. So I think it's a wonderful chance for us to bring our brains together and throw some resources on the table, right? Because I think if you're listening to this right now, that perhaps is you.
It's a good point. And I think it goes back to just what we know again about any human behavior requires three elements. You have to want to do it, the motivation. Where does motivation come from? Well, it doesn't come from the outside. So you can't give people things to be more caring. Right.
Really? It doesn't come from the outside?
No, but like I'm talking about a leader changing. It doesn't come from the outside. It sounds obvious, but it is that simple piece of research that we've known for 100 years that external things don't motivate human beings for the long term ever, period, has not made it to most organizations that I've seen or observed or leaders, right? We still think we can just manipulate someone's behavior. And that includes in leadership development, like, all of this stuff that's out there right now about the business case of DEI. The business case, you wouldn't just make someone feel included because it's the right thing to do as a human being.
That's the sad part, right?
The business case. So we've even taken these good things that we're working towards and attached them to external goals to try to get leaders to do them. It's not going to work. So even in leadership development, so motivation, comes from, relationships, purpose, knowing the reason why we're doing something, doing this, autonomy, giving people the freedom to care in their own way, I think is important. And, developing that real-time relationship with people to help remove the barriers to them to doing this. Because I do believe that there are a lot of systemic barriers that are in place that prevent leaders from making behavioral change. Like you can't rely, I think I've said this last time, but you can't rely on someone to be morally good in a system that incentivizes them not to be.
We did talk about that, yeah.
Right. So you have to look at that external environment. So motivation, but the second key factor of all human behavior is ability. Do people know how to do it? What you're asking them to do, which I would argue, no, there's, because it's relegated to common sense or intuition. And then environment. Does their environment make it possible for them to do it? And does it determine that they will do it, the behavior? So if one of those three things isn't there, it's very difficult to create transformation. So I don't really think it's motivation, in my opinion. I think it's more ability and environment. I think a lot of people, when I talk to people and I talk to the most skeptical leaders and I'm like, would you prefer to feel insignificant at work? No one raises their hand. It's like, yeah, I would. No matter your generation, no matter how hard charging or high achieving you are, people generally agree, yes, these things are important. But where the defensiveness comes in is when they don't have the ability and when the environment doesn't enable them to do it or produces too many barriers for them to do it. So that's a helpful framework to look at. If you're looking at yourself or someone else in your organization, you're like, why isn't this person changing? You should be asking, well, is the motivation there? Is the ability there? And is the environment making it possible and determining that they'll do it?
We're seeing that play out in our legacy locker room, right, Rob?
It's funny, Zach, like we were bouncing around a few emails before this podcast, and it was that the stat that Leader Factor has that says that less than 5% of toxic bosses are coachable. And we both came to the feeling that this is untrue and that the number is higher than that. And it's interesting that it's like, well, one is we'd love to see where they got this number from. But I do have that feeling, right, is that number is higher than 5%. It's definitely not 100, but it's definitely higher than 5%. Like, what do you think about that?
How do you define coachable?
Ooh.
I think the willingness to look at yourself and to change.
I like that will, right? The will,
Mm-hmm.
cultivating the will to do something.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's closer to 100%, but I'm an optimist about human beings. I mean, I don't think there are any human beings, barring, in the absence of like real clinical, like mental illness, that are incapable of change. I think there are people in systems that make it harder for them to change. But one of the frameworks that I use a lot, this is just a real practical one that I've used with people who are very like, a leader will tell me, Zach, this person's super resistant to change. They don't want to change this behavior. They keep swearing at people. They keep yelling at people. And a lot of times we just we give people really terrible feedback. And we try to change people without cultivating the want and the will to change in themselves. People will not change because you want them to change. They will change because they want to change. And one of the roles of someone else who's working with somebody, one of the things that I do is I say, okay, just 1 to 10, just humor me. 1 to 10, how willing are you to change? And nobody gives themselves a 10 on anything. And then usually you'll get like a 6 or a 7. And then I'd be like, okay, well, what do you need to get to a 10? And all of a sudden what happens is they start telling you more. And then your job as a mentor, as a leader, is to say, okay, what do I need to start doing? And what do I need to stop doing to help you get to a 10? And it's when you objectively take will and just don't leave it up to intuition, and you objectively rate it on a 1 to 10 scale, then you can start moving, right? Because if you can't name something, if you can't see something, you can't change something. So that comes out of like motivational interviewing and a motivational change framework, that you have to cultivate and understand people's will to change and remove the barriers to that before you can expect them to change. So I love that you use the word will.
And you mentioned some of the systemic barriers being one of the examples I just caught you referencing is giving or delivering feedback poorly, right? Or in a way that just isn't going to be useful to that person. What other systemic barriers do we have to remove in the conditions of that environment?
Yeah, like you can't hinge people's livelihood and financial reward on the very behavior you're trying to get them not to do.
That creates a bind or a conflict.
Yeah,
right?
It does. And it's more common than you think. Like Wells Fargo is now being under investigation again for doing multiple fake interviews with people of color to adhere to a diversity quota. So what they did was they took this DEI initiative post the George Floyd murder, and they said, we need to, hire more people of color. And so they mandated that you have to hire you have to have half of your interviewees be people of color. So what happens when someone gets a mandate from above and then they tie their job and their ability to continue as a hiring manager to that, and then they don't give them the skills to actually, how do you cultivate an inclusive workforce? What are you going to do? You're going to cheat.
Shortcuts. Yeah.
So are these bad people? Are these bad leaders? No. They're leaders that have been inappropriately incentivized to behave in immoral ways. And I believe that's one example, but there are a lot of little examples. So your environment, it does two things to human behavior. It will either makes behavior possible. So like if there was a pool in my neighborhood, it would make it possible that I could swim. Or it determines behavior. If I had to pass a swimming test to live in my neighborhood, it would determine that I would swim, right?
Yeah.
But your environment does those two things. So when you're asking people to collaborate, well, does it does your environment make it possible for people to collaborate? Or do you jump on Zoom calls and jump into what you're going to do with each other before you give space for how to be with one another in your meetings? What's that structure? If you want to determine that does it determine that people collaborate? Are people rewarded for personal sales, or are they rewarded for team sales? Right? So, if you want people to collaborate, but you're rewarding them for individual achievement, not going to happen.
Not going to work.
So there are many examples of that. So a good question, like a listener might ask is, does my environment make it possible to do the behavior I say I want? And does my environment determine the behavior I say I want, which is even more powerful?
Love it. Haven't had you here in a year, and I kind of feel like last time you were here, we were riffing on all things purpose, and it was the midpoint of the pandemic and the disruption, and we were all very inspired because we were seeing that was some of the silver lining, right? Which that more people were coming. Your clients, you said, you saw an uptick in coming to the table and reconsidering some of the purpose work that you maybe tried to do with them in the past, and now all of a sudden it was feeling a lot more prevalent or relevant. And we were all sort of envisioning the possibilities of that and what that could possibly accelerate in terms of the future of work. And so I'm just curious, a year later, how has that all played out? Has that continued to be the upward trajectory that we were all hoping it would?
Yeah, well, let's look at the data, right? So let's look at MIT's study that found that toxic culture is 10 times more predictive than pay and benefits and compensation. People leaving. And how do they define toxic culture? Well, let's think about that. Undervalued, underappreciated, not respected, right? And that gets back to that mattering piece.
Yes.
McKinsey's study that just came out, over 500 people, a diverse sample, found that the number one, the element that was in almost 40% of every person's top reason why they were leaving was uncaring leaders. The third was meaningful work, right? So it was, and I will say it wasn't a great resignation at all here in the US, has been publicized, because actually we're back to pre-pandemic workforce participation levels. So people didn't leave the workforce. They left uncaring leaders and dehumanizing organizations.
Wow.
So actually this was a demand for dignity, not a great resignation. And it was a demand for experiencing more significance and purpose where people are spending the majority of their lives. And people had some choices, especially here in the States. So I think it just shows us, and I think people are seeing that data now and they can't really escape that. And so I think we're actually at the tip of it, though. I think people are actually realizing that, again, it's going to be like, if you don't show people why they matter, it's going to be like not having a website if you're a business.
You're not going to be able to stay in the game, in other words.
No,
right?
no. You're going to have an existential problem. Really, if reason why people are leaving your organization is because of uncaring leadership, you have an existential problem.
And explain to our audience what you mean. I think Rob and I are clearly on your wavelength, but just to make sure everybody out there is riding this wave with us, what do you mean by existential in that context?
I think that your organization has a threat to its existence in the long term.
Exactly. That's what we've been saying, right? Is like, if you don't adapt as everybody's coming to this purpose table to get a feast of what they need, right? You're just going to be washed up to shore when that tidal wave hits, and it has hit.
Let me add, so there's some hope to that, though, because I don't ever want to
seem too dark.
Well, no, sometimes I think I'm like, I never want to come across as shaming or blaming leaders, right? For not doing this.
No.
I think that what's most important right now is that we show compassion for people who have been trying very hard in their own way and may need to make adjustments and learn, and learning is hard. And I think that's the best approach to this is compassion. I think the Dalai Lama says compassion is the radicalism of our time. And I think that's the radical approach that we all need, is to have compassion for each other as we're trying to make these changes. And I think that's what's ultimately going to, you said, how do we get people on board? I think it's having compassion for where people are, where people have been, the challenges, the environmental challenges that have created the behaviors that people probably don't want themselves. I think that's the starting point.
What comes next? Because I kind of feel like we get that. And I think that's why we created this show, right? Is because we understand how complex it is and all the different variables that you're up against as a leader, trying to make this transition. We have all these different experts from all these different walks of life and fields because it is so complex, right? Like we're saying, there's so many different variables. But beyond just compassion, how do we really help to empower them to be a part of this, right? To actually want to take responsibility and ownership of up-leveling their skill sets in these interpersonal ways?
I think that you have to make it personal for people. I mean, people have to experience the concepts that you're talking about. For example, again, one of the things that I use often is I say to people, if you think about your most difficult employee on your team, imagine them going home and sitting around a table with people who deeply love them. What do you want them saying about how you treated them today to their kid? And all of a sudden, right, once you develop that, making it personal, get people to rehumanize each other.
There it is.
It can be really powerful because we've gotten to this point, I think, from a macro political perspective, where we've dehumanized the other, right? It's even how, if you've talked to someone and they've said the employees, well, we need to get the employees to do this. You're an employee, right? It's not the employees. There's not a leader in employees, right? You are an employee too. So it's moving from this I and them to this we language and really rehumanizing people, I think is a first step. And I also think like getting people to experience these things, like when in the last 7 days, have you experienced the greatest moment of purpose? I guarantee if you ask that question to 12,000 people, not one of them would say, when I got my direct deposit.
Yeah.
When I got my bonus.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. When I got a great quarterly earnings report, when I closed that deal. No, we say things like helping each other, contributing to one another. And I think when people can see it and feel it for themselves, and then you say, oh, well, okay, what skills are you enacting to make sure everybody feels what you just felt in your organization? And then they say, okay. And I think that's a key step.
I love that. Make it personal.
It's incredibly hard, right? And I feel like I'm now going to have to build a business case for meaning.
No, don't build a business case.
If you weren't listening to Zach's advice, you would. Yeah.
Don't build a business case for meaning.
But it's like, it's funny, right? Because like
Rob's humor.
All the data shows that these things are good. And yet we still get the resistance in doing it. And it's the same thing with DEI. Like, why are we building a business case? Literally, I spent 10 years in corporate and I built business cases for everything. That's all I did for my job. Like, it was like, why should we have a valve here so the oil doesn't spill into a river? Business case, right?
Right.
Like, this is a good thing to do, but you still have to put a business case together, right?
Oy.
And that's part of the system, I suppose. But it's also feeding that, which we talked about with Mike Zanny, which is like the concept that started in the 80s where all that matters was the shareholder. That's where the quarterly earnings matter and the business case matters. And it's all about next quarter, next quarter. So what do you think
all of
about
that?
that?
Yeah, all of that matters. All of the results and things matters, but there are, and I posted this on LinkedIn and I don't know why people liked it because it's so obvious, right? I posted this graphic of like lagging indicators versus leading indicators.
I remember you mentioned this last time too.
I did?
Yeah, I think so.
And I can't believe that it was popular because what I said is basically that no financial metric is not mediated through a human being. So shareholder value, everything else. So the lagging indicators of all of those things, the leading indicators of those things are human well-being. You can't have a healthy economy without healthy humans. You can't have a healthy organization without healthy humans in the long term.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So all of this idea of like meaning and all of it's like making a business case for breathing, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just like what happens is that we dehumanize and we forget about the leading indicators and we just try to go, I want to get an effect by pursuing an effect, and it's impossible. So one of the things I think we have to do is we have to really show people the connection.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, these things are important.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, results are important. You need profit to deliver more purpose, to have a business. That stuff is vital, like oxygen,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not why you breathe,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it's the leading indicators of all of those things, which is people. You know, I often ask people who are obsessed with like shareholder value or earnings reports. I was like, for people to get those earnings report, what do you think is the optimal human state of mind? Describe that human to me. And what do they say? Motivated. Well, okay, good. Yeah, me too. They have to believe in it. Okay, yeah, good. Me too. You know, and they start naming all of the things that we're trying to do.
Yes, totally. It's interesting because I noticed like all this research out there is in and around behavior, which is one step closer to what we're talking about, right? In terms of the meaning. But it's why Rob and I approach everything from the mindset perspective, because we're trying to do that root cause analysis, you know, in terms of well, what comes before the behavior? Well, it's the beliefs that house the meaning that release that neurochemistry, right? Emotionally fueling the decision to behave in ways that lead to the impact on results or bottom lines or metrics. So
I'd say that we're all also responsible for what we're seeing, because what we ultimately reward is who we become as a society. And what I mean by that is that if we're on LinkedIn liking posts where people self-promote all of their achievements, and then when people post, you know, something about, you know, remembering someone's full name and, you know, no one posts it because it's boring, right?
Yeah.
We actually can inadvertently reward achievement-based culture. And what we reward is what we become. You know, I would love to see a redefinition of success. Success is really, you know, producing results that are important and dignifying people in the process. Like giving people human dignity, I think, is success. And I actually think if we start there, then the results will follow.
And it's funny, right? Like, Susan, when we started, you said to me to define success in all these categories.
It's one of my favorite moves in the chair.
And it is a different question, right? And it makes you think about what's truly important to you. And
Mattering.
It was that, like, and then also the other hard part, right, was another thing we had a lot of, like, I know I had a lot of trouble with, but it's like, you're saying like emotions are going to help you perform better. And I was like, if I could shut them all off, I would be better.
I remember.
And that was, I mean, I had a lot of pain, but it was also like a lot of what I had learned, like you're playing sports and it's just like, suck it up and just like perform. And like when I was playing poker, it was like, if you could close off all emotions and just make decisions like a robot, you'd be really good.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like this element of what are we teaching folks when they're small, and then when they get to be, like I always say it, we're just hurt children in big bodies with big responsibilities, and that's the real, like, it starts young, like we talked about at the beginning.
Yeah, because we're talking about how we close off to protect ourselves, right? And I think that's why our process is the journey from human doing to human being. Goes right to the jugular of what Zach is talking about, right? Which is we got to rehumanize ourselves in the context of work, because that's unfortunately what some of those systemic barriers have manifested, is that disassociation from our emotions. Because we'll get more done, right? We'll be more productive and all that.
And I think that gets at the core of it, Rob. And I think that we spend so much time teaching people what to do as human beings and not how to be a human being and what it's like to be a human being. And that's why all of that beingness gets stuffed down, right? sacrificed for the doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's a pertinent lesson, because if you think about how you develop leaders, or you're developing yourself, are you developing this sense of being, how to be, or are you just developing your people or yourself on what to do?
Mm-hmm.
That's the journey of
And it helps, I think, to have these questions though, to ask yourself these little gut check
Prompts,
things.
yeah.
Like, am I focusing on doing or being here in this moment?
Mm-hmm.
Am I focusing on what I'm going to get for doing this, or why I'm doing this?
Mm-hmm.
And it does, like, in your mindset work, I think, is important, because, the questions we ask ourselves really determine how we live our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Our
Mm-hmm.
lives are really answers to the questions we ask ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're going to ask, like, again, like, oh, what am I going to get from this person?
Mm-hmm.
It's very different than what am I going to give to this person?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that consciousness is the entry point, right, into the growth. That's why we work. We kind of do this whole leadership thing differently, right? In that we approach it through the portal known as mindfulness, which is just
right.
Awareness comes before intelligence. So we can't solve until we acknowledge that something that we should maybe be thinking a little bit more deeply about. And all those questions that you're mentioning are primers to get us to think a little bit more consciously about how we're relating to ourselves and how we're relating to other people in the context of that decision. But right back to the top of this interview where we talked about the response, right?
Yes.
That's where the growth lives, is in that space between whatever that is that's triggering the belief, and then having a little bit of mindfulness in and around how we want to relate to that, right?
What do you do with people who resist mindfulness? As they say, oh, that's not me. I've tried it. I can't bring myself into the moment. Or, I mean, there's a lot of people out there. So I guess flipping it back to you all, as what do you do? Like, for the people, this is important, all the data on it, you should do it. You should be able to choose your response. How do you close that gap?
Well, I think it's experiential, like you said, right? Which is in the neuro-linguistic kind of way, which is how we approach all this brain training thing that we do in the chair with our people. It's getting them into that mindful, conscious, aware state, that presence of being, right, in the here and now, and then helping them anchor into how resourceful a state that is and how that feels and what looks different. It's experiential for me. What do you think, Rob?
Mindfulness, and this is the part that folks forget, is it's not just sitting and meditating.
Right.
Right? It could be playing your favorite sport. For you, Zach, it could be riding a bike, right? When you're going down the mountain, you cannot think about,
no.
I got to do this interview tomorrow.
No.
Oh, what about this?
No, not at all.
Right? Like, you're there.
Right.
Yeah.
And that is mindfulness.
Yeah.
And it allows you to feel your best. And that we talk about flow, right? But that's also what allows you to feel your best. And often the folks that are resistant to this, they're resistant to sitting calmly with their eyes closed because it feels unsafe. And that means they have lots of healing to do, which is for therapy. But it's often from a place of that. And you actually can see the data that, sometimes for people, meditation actually triggers anxiety and depression and suicidal ideation. It did for me. But after a significant journey of healing, now I can be. And I can be in myself as a whole.
I just wrote something down because I realized that I screwed up, because I asked, why are people resistant? But that's not the case. And I think that's a trap. This is actually a great lesson for leaders listening to the podcast.
Yay.
Is
Love
that
this.
a person is not resistant. they are behaving in ways that demonstrate resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a whole number of reasons why,
Mm-hmm.
including I may be one of them. And there may be things going on in their environment,
Mm-hmm.
right? But that's a big reframe.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we need to take, and I think that you articulated it really well, but I also think that as for leaders, we often do see people or see ourselves as, I am resistant. I am not mindful. I am this, I am that, versus behavior, there's our behaviors that are indicating these things.
Here's the other reframe. It's a part of you is resistant.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And other parts of you are not.
Right.
And we are all many parts. And we are a system within ourselves.
Right.
And that system is looking for safety, and it is confident and calm and all these things. It's just parts of us take over when we're in pain.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think that's compassion. Well, not only compassion for yourself, but then, having compassion for others in that way, in the fullness that they bring. Because I hear that all the time, right? The employees are this, or this person is that.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually think that's a big barrier that, we just got to now, but is really a central barrier of when, again, and I think it goes back to the rehumanization of ourselves and each other in its full complexity.
Mm-hmm.
And so this leads us, and I love this question. Zach, who are you?
Oh, changing it up with a different
Who
big
am
gun.
I? My true self? Gosh, if you wanted me to, so you're not seeing Zach right now, right? You're seeing Zach in an interview right now with you, but there is a true deep self beneath all of the doing and the titles and the things and the activities that express that self. And what I'm trying to do is to spend as much time revealing that through what I do as possible. But you can't really see it. You can't see my true self apart from the essence of through what I'm doing. I think it's there underneath all of the external things that would take many, many hours and years to peel away.
Or a part 3, perhaps.
A part 3.
I think we just opened up a portal to another one.
But seriously, so it's a portal to another conversation, but it's a great question because the identity, we often identify with things. So we rely on other things to identify ourselves. To think about it, right, Rob? If we ask that question normally, what do people say?
I'll tell you what I said to Susan when she asked me the first time. I said, I'm a reliability engineer, I'm a water polo player, and I'm an MIT graduate.
Yeah.
That's what I said.
And what did I say back to you? You remember?
It was, who are you, not what have you done?
Right.
I said, those are the roles that you play, right?
Exactly.
It's like, I'm a hockey player, I'm a mom, I'm a podcaster. These are
roles.
what's
so funny about this question, about this, like the serendipitousness of this interview, is that today I posted something on LinkedIn on Instagram. And I just thought about it this morning, it's like, you don't have worth because of your output, right? You have worth because you're a human being.
Mm-hmm. That's why we asked that question, right?
Yeah.
Because I think it's a portal into that self-worth.
Right.
And I think that is at the epicenter of helping somebody rehumanize.
Right.
Is that we are because we are. We are worthy because I have breath.
Exactly.
I have life. So therefore, I'm here for a reason. There's purpose to this. Let me go do something with that matters and is meaningful. And it's usually the way I thread that from a mindset strategy perspective. But it also goes right back to the top of what you were challenging in terms of leadership is a role. Leading is a behavior.
Right.
But something deeper than that I think we all agree on, right, is like that all starts with the being. That's the epicenter that we really need to focus on when we're trying to inspire or empower anybody to go on this mission with us. So here's how I want to change it up. I know last time we pulled out the big guns in terms of the legacy question.
Oh, wow.
But I want to switch it up a little bit because we already asked.
Wait, the who are you? Isn't that's not the what are you gonna do now?
That was the big gun, but I have a little something up my sleeve. So I was just wondering, what do you think the legacy for all of us is going to be in the rocking chair, right? If we really inspire and empower our people to start rehumanizing themselves, right? And starting to focus on the leadership journey within, in terms of connecting with that sense of who they are and why they're here before even thinking about some of these greater aspects of leadership. What do you think the legacy is going to be for all of us?
I mean, I imagine like a community, right? Where every person actually believes that they are significant, like actually believes that they have a unique, irreplaceable self that makes a unique, irreplaceable difference. I believed that. And then they were in an environment that continually provided them the evidence of that significance. Because to solve all the problems we need to solve, we need as many of those unique gifts as possible and those unique voices as possible. So I think that we are leaving so many resources off the table. We're losing out on so many human gifts because people are in environments that condition them to believe that they don't matter. And so I think that the legacy will be that we become better because all of our gifts, all of the uniqueness is in its place to solve the unique challenge we've all been tasked to solve.
Such a fun space to explore, right? When you really think about the untapped human potential that's waiting on the other side of that door.
I just think of that one person, right, who disengages from the world because they're unemployed. And then they're told just to get a job, and they get a job, but they never understand what their function is, what they're good at, what their strengths are. They never have anybody who says, what do you love to do today? What were you good at today? I mean, how do you want to improve people's lives around you? And I think of that person. And then I think about that person meeting the statistically average 80,000 people that they'll meet in their lifetime. And how many of those 80,000 people miss out on that person's gifts because they don't believe they have them. And then you multiply that, right? And I think that's what's at stake, really.
And inversely to that, the rising tides that lift all boats, right? Like in terms of that untapped potential, I think it's exciting to explore what the world would be like then.
Right. And I don't think we can only say it's you as an individual haven't tapped into your potential.
Yeah.
I think we as a community have failed.
Yeah.
That individual. And one of the biggest, one of the most tragic things about Western civilization is that we've over prioritized individual well-being over community well-being. And you cannot have a well individual and an unwell community will become an unwell individual.
Let's leave people to marinate on that.
I love the I love the self-care, self-love movement, but it's been taken to the extreme. And again, if you just take care of yourself, if you help yourself and you don't contribute to creating a community that creates significance, you'll be left with nothing at the end of the day. Self-obsession almost always leads to self-destruction. And so we got to be very careful with making sure we create a community that is compassionate, we're looking outward, and that supports the behaviors and the mindsets and what we want for ourselves.
Ooh, Zach, you always bring the heat. And Too bad we should book you for 2 hours. We could keep, we could keep going.
Lesson learned.
I've been really thinking about all of this stuff though, like because we can take personal development stuff, and
Yeah,
I'm in
too
that
far.
space,
Yeah, I know.
and it can go too far because everybody starts helping themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And where's the community infrastructure?
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're seeing a little bit of that tension. We're kind of coming back out of a rise in the self-help literature and the popular literature to now into wait a minute. The community we're coming back into is broken because we've retreated into ourselves for the last decade.
That'll be part 3 because I have many questions. It's just went.
Yes, part 3, we'll get Zach queued up for that one. And obviously for folks out there, if you want to check out more from Zach, well, go back into the archives. You can find his interview. You can also pick up a copy of his book, The Invisible Leader, and head on over to zachmercurio.com for all stuff's there. And then also you can follow him on LinkedIn and hit like to all the obvious things that he posts. Zach, is there anything else that you'd love to tell us about?
No, that's it. I mean, I'm stay tuned because I am about to do a really large study interviewing people on experiences of mattering. So I will be calling for volunteers soon on LinkedIn. And really the question is, think about the first time in your life when you believed that you mattered. And who was around? What did they say? What did they do? And I'm going to be inviting a lot of people from all different walks of life to share that.
Sure. Yeah. Shoot it our way when it's out, and we'll definitely share it and spread it around our circle. So we'd love to support you there. Yeah. It's a great question. Now I'm like, oh no, when was it for me?
Like where you mattered as a human being the first time. Yeah.
It's probably a lot later than I would think.
Oh yeah. For most people it is too.
So for us, head on over to whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on and hit subscribe to the Leadership Launchpad Project. And for all our stuff, leadership mindset development and everything else that we do in the leadership space, head on over to elitehighperformance.com for all of that. Susan, is there anything you want to leave us with today?
No, I'm just so grateful that we had Zach back in. I knew he was going to bring the heat. My intuition told me so. And I'm just so fired up about this interview. I just think it's laced with everything our leaders need to get on their journey towards playing their biggest impact game. That's why we say it, right? This stuff, we don't start with the self and taking responsibility in our self-leadership first because we expect it to stay there. That's the launch pad, but it's the launch pad towards the mission of collectively getting together as 2.0 leaders, right? To change the way the game's being played forever for each other. So thank you, Zach, for reinforcing that, because that's totally aligned with the mission that we're on here at the Leadership Launchpad Project.
Thank you both.
It totally is. And for me, I'm going to leave you with a quote from me. This is the first
I love
time.
that.
I do too. It's the first.
And so I said, through the process of becoming, I becomes we becomes us, and us becomes oneness. Zach, thank you so much for joining us. We're definitely going to get you in the queue to come back for a third time because we love this. And everyone listening, thank you so much for listening. And we'll see you all next week.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.